Athena, and move on now to Dr. Roba Abbas, who takes Athena's public interest stuff, if that makes sense, and places it in a contextual application within co-design. How do you do that? How do you build public interest technologies? And one of the areas Dr. Abbas looks at is cooperative inquiry as an approach. And I'm going to switch to her video now, and we'll take off in a moment.
This talk at the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. I was very fortunate to be present at the launch of this seminar series and feel just as fortunate today to be presenting alongside a range of wonderful speakers. So I'd like to thank Professor Katina, Michael and the ASU team for this opportunity. My name is Roba Abbas and I'm a lecturer in the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Wollongong. And my short seminar today will be focused on co-designing in the public interest. I'll specifically be looking at an overview of theories and methodological underpinnings that allow us to appreciate the complexities surrounding co-designing in the public interest and the configurations associated with specific co-design efforts. Now, necessarily, our discussion must commence with the theoretical underpinnings and the significant methodological developments that allow us to appreciate co-design as a specific philosophy within the technology design and development domain. So starting our discussion with systems and open systems theory allows us or provides us with a lens by which we can view our body of interest or our co-design effort. When we think about open systems more specifically, we gain an appreciation of the environment that our specific system has to be receptive to and that is influenced by. And additionally, we look at feedback loops and mechanisms as being really necessary components to define how we control the system and how we iterate and redesign, for instance. Now, a systems basis provides us with an additional awareness and recognition of the complexities associated with a range of components working together to serve a common objective. Traditional systems notions and technology design efforts were focused around technology. Now, if we look at further refining our scope of discussion, we can look to socio-technical systems theory to further refine and define our lens as being comprised of not only the technical, but also an appreciation of the social elements or subsystems, as they're called in socio-technical systems theory. This recognition of the social and technical working together to achieve a common interest, or at least to appreciate common and potentially competing interests, is very powerful when we think about the shift to human-computer interaction, or the way that humans actually respond to, in the initial instance, computer-based systems. And now this field is actually defined by interaction and engagement with complex socio-technical structures and systems. This jump from socio-technical systems to human-computer interaction and then co-design provides us with the necessary framework and theories and methodologies to define what co-design actually means from a technology design and development or a systems engineering perspective, for instance. Rather than focusing on a technological determinism or technological determinism as a perspective, co-design rather from a systems and human-computer interaction perspective is about the theories, methodologies and processes that involve the social elements in addition to the technical. That is, they involve stakeholder participation in systems design and arguably development efforts. So the development efforts allow us to sort of veer our discussion more towards co-production in addition to co-design. Now, I'd like to highlight one point, and that is the definition of the system in terms of a unit of analysis or level of analysis. And that's quite crucial in defining any co-design activity or effort. So if we think about levels, what we mean in this instance is the unit of analysis by which we conceptualise a socio-technical system and where we place our emphasis and focus. So we can do so at the individual level, at a work systems level, where we're thinking about processes and we're thinking about theories and frameworks such as those presented by Alter, where we move beyond the technology or the system itself as defined by a technological artefact, to consider more the people, the processes and activities, infrastructure, certainly the technology, but also the environment and strategic situation or strategic context within which a specific technology is actually embedded. We also have an organisational unit within which the work processes exist and the operations-based processes exist. And of course, there's also the societal system that can be defined as a socio-technical system that requires or that is suited to a co-design effort. So we can co-design at each of these levels, but depending on our choice, and it could be a nested approach whereby we look at individuals at the micro level and work our way up to the macro level and have embedded levels of systems or subsystems within the broader socio-technical suprasystem, for instance. Now, depending on which level we select as being the focus or the emphasis of our co-design efforts, there are a range of implications. There are certainly implications on the theoretical framework and the selection of the appropriate theories to supplement our existing systems and socio-technical base. Also, the conceptualisation of the socio-technical system necessarily alters depending on this unit of analysis. The choice and selection of the co-design exercise will be influenced by our level of analysis. So these are the actual techniques that are used to engage with stakeholders. The ethical challenges that emerge will obviously differ. Methodology selection, nature of stakeholder engagement, and degrees of input will be configured in a different way depending on our units of analysis. And I've highlighted methodology, stakeholder engagement, and degrees of input for further analysis in the following slides. So let's look at these in a bit more detail to gain an understanding of the complexities associated with co-design when applied in practice, for instance. So our methodologies themselves are open to interpretation and are also influenced by a range of factors. These factors can include the context within which a system operates, regardless or irrespective of level of analysis, the application area, the actual definition of the socio-technical system or its initial conceptualisation and what we define to be the scope and boundaries of that system, and the purpose of the design exercise. And we know that the purpose of our initial objectives of a system will differ depending on the overall goal of a specific socio-technical design effort. Stakeholders themselves also merit additional consideration. So we can think of stakeholder types, for instance, and the categories that exist within. The nature of interest in the system and the design exercise. So stakeholders have a legitimate interest in a specific system. Being able to define and accurately represent those interests in order to account for them in design efforts is crucial. And last but most definitely not least is the degrees of input. So we can think of stakeholders as assuming a range of roles, and this is adapted from work conducted 2 years ago as part of a co-design effort with my colleagues at the University of Wollongong. And we define stakeholder categories based on some work conducted in the late 90s and early 2000s by Druin et al. We define certain stakeholder categories that allow us to define degrees of input, and this is crucial when we're discussing configurations around socio-technical co-design efforts. So we have observer right through to design partner. And this ranges, or these roles range from limited degrees of input right through to continue on very intimate and close engagements with co-design partners or stakeholders. So irrespective of a stakeholder, we can have a limited or non-existent connection with them, where they're purely observing the co-design exercise. It could be in a user-based scenario where there is limited engagement, and this tends to involve the testing of an existing or a commercial technology or system, for example, in the hope of informing future iterations. You have a somewhat limited degree of input or a moderate degree of input when we start to think about the tester, and that involves usually the evaluation of prototypes as part of the co-design engagement. You have informant, which tends to be more on the moderate to high side in terms of, or increased side in terms of degrees of input, and that is where co-design partners or stakeholders are quite influential in the early stages of co-design effort, for example, or in the preliminary design process. And then you have the co-design partnership, which is really characterised by this continual degree or of input, where stakeholders are almost on a level playing field with the actual systems designers and developers and assume a very active role in the design process. And this is really the highest degree of engagement. Now, the reason why this is mentioned is I'd like to show you a number of real-world examples that demonstrate the way in which co-design manifests itself in a real-world scenario, but also allows us to appreciate the complexities with co-designing in the public interest. So in this initial instance here, this is an example of a co-design methodology from a conceptual perspective that allows for co-design theories and methodologies to be embedded within existing engineering design and development efforts. So I won't spend too much time discussing this point because I'd like to focus on another example, but we've also engaged in some work to actually pinpoint the changing or morphing nature of human-computer interaction as a field and what that might require in terms of participation. And that's the work we're largely involved in at the moment. But the example that I'd like to highlight in order to demonstrate this complexity that is inherent in co-design processes is this specific example, which is part of work that we conducted as part of a University of Wollongong Global Challenges project that involved a co-design partnership with children in a stakeholder-inclusive methodological and socio-technical manner. So we defined stakeholders of interest that we wanted to capture perspectives of, and we also reviewed theory and methodological developments in the co-design space that would be appropriate to the engagement of primarily children and then educators and other stakeholder types. And I'd like to present you with this notion of configurations and complexities based on that example. So if we look at methodologies, stakeholder types, and the roles that specific stakeholder types might assume, it gives us a sense of appreciation around the actual configurations that are possible and the complexities that stem from these configurations. So after reviewing a range of methodologies as part of that case study that I mentioned on the earlier slide, we looked at cooperative inquiry, contextual inquiry, consensus participation, participatory design, and cooperative designs as sort of subsets to co-design as a broad umbrella term. And we actually came to the conclusion, based on our research, that cooperative inquiry was best suited to the stakeholder category of children. Now, in terms of the way we configured our co-design techniques and implementation, we went for a complete design partnership that was really characterised by that continual degrees of engagement, because we wanted to capture the perspectives of children within the 3 to 5 year age bracket. Now, the selection of this specific configuration inevitably influences the techniques by which we actually engage with participants and the way we configure and we assemble our co-design activity. Now, this is just for one stakeholder type. Now, you can imagine the more stakeholders we add, so too does the complexity increase where co-design efforts and initiatives are concerned. Now, what does this tell us, just to sort of wrap up this discussion in terms of co-designing in the public interest? I think when we view co-design and when we view public interest technologies, we'll start to notice quite a lot of overlap in their orientation and what they both attempt to achieve in terms of a philosophy. So co-design and public interest technology, in my perspective or where I'm concerned, can't actually be extricated as terms. I think they work hand in hand in order to embody a range of principles or a range of pillars. So they both work in terms of an orientation towards technology for good, or technology in the public interest, working towards the capturing of the public interest and representing them in specific socio-technical systems, for example. They both focus on an inter, cross and multidisciplinary focus. They are human-centred in their nature. They tend to be inclusive, although there is literature that moves beyond this inclusive approach to consider other configurations and a multitude of ways in which we can design systems depending on context. They are iterative by nature. They tend to encompass and think about socio-technical systems just by the fact that they are working in terms of technology for good. Therefore, they have a socio-technical representation and conceptualization. They're about social impact and implications. They also allow for ethics and ethical alignment and the embedding of ethical principles within traditional either engineering or technology-based design and development efforts. And the point that I'd like to leave you with is the idea of community. So there's a community focus to public interest technology and also to co-design as a philosophy of design. And we've started, in addition or in conjunction with Katina Michael, we've started to talk about community and communities of care And I think that's a good point to sort of finish this discussion or this presentation on, is that it is our responsibility to actually emphasise the importance of caring for the public, of caring for the individuals who are influenced or who will be using our technologies. And that's quite a powerful and an important role that we hold as designers and developers of technologies and systems engineers. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to receiving questions in relation to this presentation. I've got a number of questions that have been posed that I'd just like to address now, and these have emerged in a range of forums recently. So there's a lot of terms that commence with co that I think sometimes are often confused or selected in specific scenarios. So I've been asked this question several times recently: why co-design and not co-production? In terms of answering this question, I think it's helpful to look at the broader context, or at least the development of all of these specific streams of literature. So if we think about the initial conceptions around participatory approaches, and we refer back to the 1970s and 80s, for example, there were really two streams or two schools of thought. So we had the participatory design, and we also had user-centered design. And this gradually morphed into a discussion where those two terms really converged, and we started to think about common elements between the two. Now, currently, when we think about co-design, we can view it as sitting beneath a broad umbrella term, which is co-creation. And co-creation really encompasses not only co-design, but co-production. So when we think about whether we select co-design versus co-production, so the way I'm thinking about it at the moment is I think that co-design is the precursor for co-production. Therefore, our efforts really need to be focused on getting the co-design efforts right before we can proceed to co-production, which really extends beyond the actual design process to encompassing stakeholders in the actual delivery of initially a service, but also a technological product in this instance. So should the focus of co-designing the public interest be on inclusion only? I find this particular discussion to be really fascinating, and I think we can situate it within the broader context of having a situational awareness, or the idea of context in general where co-design is concerned. When we think about inclusion, it's obviously a very important element to co-design. It's one of the basic pillars of co-design and any participatory approach. But inclusion is only context specific. So we need to shift our focus in addition to, or in supplement to inclusion, to think about the development of a multitude of technological systems or socio-technical systems within a range of contexts, and to be inclusive and to capture diversity within those specific contexts. So we might have, for instance, a location-based services solution, for example, that exists within the Australian context, and we cannot assume that if we've engaged in a co-design effort in Australia that we can immediately translate that effort to the United States, for example, but rather we need inclusion within a specific context, but also a multitude of co-design efforts that move beyond this singular view of co-design, that once we've done it once in one context that we can readily be translated to another, which is not necessarily the case. Thank you for your time and for this opportunity to deliver my talk today, and I look forward to feedback and to an ongoing discussion as to the value of co-design and to socio-technical and public interest technology discussions in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roba Abbas from the University of Wollongong. As you can see, we had an emphasis on cooperation with the first speaker, our keynote, Katina. We've seen Roba now talk about the implementation of and methodologies, as in co-design using cooperative inquiry.